The first sign was the light. Not the warm glow of dawn or the neon hum of a sleeping city, but an unnatural, seething brilliance that tore the sky apart like ruptured flesh. The rift had no sound, no tremor, no warning. One moment the sky was whole, the next it was split open like a gaping wound. Then came the bleeding. Thick, black ichor rained down in slow, viscous drops, hissing as it burned through pavement and metal. The first reports mentioned strange distortions. People standing too close to the substance collapsed with nosebleeds, then seizures, then worse. Then the creatures poured out. At first, they were small, insect-like horrors with too many spindly limbs and slick, dark carapaces. They spread fast. By the end of the first day, Cheyenne was gone. By the end of the first week, the United States had splintered into pockets of burning resistance. By the third week, the rift was expanding. The creatures weren't mindless. They spread with intent. They didn't just feed. They built. They prepared. And humanity couldn't stop them. Command briefing, New Denver military outpost. Final transmission from Commander Elias Rourke. Location: perimeter defensive line, Zone 3. This is it. This is the last stand. The assembled faces were gaunt, blood-stained, yet still determined. What was left of Earth's final army crowded into a makeshift war room, a concrete bunker beneath the ruins of Denver. Their ranks had been whittled down to barely 300 soldiers, and their ammunition was nearly spent. Yet they had firepower enough for one final strike. Every weapon we have, every last bullet, aim it at the rift, Rourke said, his voice raw from shouting. He fumbled for a half-smoked cigarette, lighting it with trembling fingers. Sergeant Dwayne Keller nodded, lips curling into a weary grin. Gonna be one hell of a show, Commander. No one in the room expected to survive. This wasn't about living, it was about spitting in the face of the inevitable. Lieutenant Marcus Vale, the last trained medic among them, spoke in a numb whisper.
We should have burned the world ourselves before they could do this.
Shut up and load up, snapped Monroe, her sniper rifle across her lap. I've got one bullet left for whatever crawls out of that rift. A deep tremor shook the bunker, bits of concrete and dust sifting down. The rift was expanding again, straining at the seams of reality. Above ground, the apocalypse was in full swing. Outside, the final battle was moments away. New Denver's trenches were more like mass graves than defensive lines, a mess of broken walls, sandbags, and rebar forming a last bastion against the unstoppable. The air reeked of smoke, gunpowder, and rotting flesh. Soldiers sat at the lip of bunkers, cleaning rifles and checking magazines with the resigned calm of those who had nothing left to lose. Rourke walked among them, hearing the crunch of spent shell casings beneath his boots. He recognized the look in every eye. There was no pretense of hope, just a dogged determination to fight until the bitter end. Nearby, Keller was arguing with Monroe about how best to deploy the last of the demolitions. He wanted to rig the battlefield with explosives, turning the ground itself into a killing field. Monroe insisted they needed snipers high enough to provide cover if everything went sideways. They never stop, she muttered, wiping grime from the scope of her rifle. They can bleed, Keller shot back, slamming a fresh magazine into his sidearm. So we can kill them. That's enough. Vale was stationed in a makeshift medical bay, a tent draped in blood-stained sheets. They lacked the supplies to help anyone near death. Bandages, antibiotics, painkillers. Everything was almost gone. The wounded who couldn't stand were already resigned to their fate. Rourke paused as a distant hum suddenly vibrated through the air. Then the ground rumbled beneath his feet. Every soldier present whipped their gaze to the horizon at the same moment. A seething black tide stretched across the dim sky. Limbs, claws, and alien eyes glistened in the flicker of scattered fires, thousands of creatures marching in unison. A chill washed over them all. Here they come, Vale breathed. Rourke took a drag from his cigarette and exhaled, choking back fear. Positions! He barked into his radio. The final stand was no longer a plan on paper. It was reality, bearing down on them in a writhing mass of nightmare fuel. Explosions lit the night sky in a grim spectacle. Artillery shells detonated within the surging horde, spraying alien bodies and debris in every direction. The pounding thunder of gunfire echoed through the skeletal remains of New Denver, where a few hundred human soldiers stood firm in their last defense. Rourke scanned the chaos from atop a collapsed overpass. Below him, the creatures advanced in endless waves, their chitinous forms glistening under the glare of raging fires. He gripped his radio and shouted, "Focus fire on the center flank!" Tracer rounds raked across the night, tearing into the aliens. Farther off, Monroe and her sniper team perched on a rooftop, picking off the larger monsters with deadly precision. Closer to ground level, Keller led a demolition squad, timing IEDs and claymores to catch swarms at their densest points. Each explosion shook the streets, ripping creatures apart in bursts of flame. Yet still they came, crawling over heaps of their own dead with an unholy resolve. "Reload!" Keller hollered, voice cracking with strain. The stench of burning flesh and sulfur clung to every breath. Devoyle darted from one makeshift triage station to another, trying to keep wounded soldiers alive. Ammunition was low, and medical supplies even lower. Bodies, both human and alien, littered the ground, slick with blood that gleamed under flickering emergency lights. Static erupted in Rourke's earpiece, frantic voices overlapping in confusion. "They're flanking us on the south side. Need backup. We're pinned at the demolition line. Watch for flyers overhead." A shrill howl cut through the clamoring. The creatures were adapting, forming new attack patterns. Even with the bombs and bullets, the defenders were slowly being pushed back. Each inch they surrendered was reclaimed by the alien onslaught. An explosion on the far edge of the city illuminated a rolling cloud of smoke, briefly revealing a glimpse of the rift overhead, its seething brightness pulsing like a wound that refused to close. Rourke clenched his jaw. They had to hold out, at least long enough to direct their final strike at that damn tear in the sky. Shell casings shimmered under the firefight's glow. Soldiers, drenched in sweat and grime, kept firing until their guns jammed or overheated. Radios crackled with urgency, then desperation, then silence. It was only the first phase of what would become the last battle for humanity. The thunder of artillery briefly died down as crews rushed to reload. In the lull, Rourke's ears rang with the aftershock of countless blasts. His mind reeled, trying to gauge how many defenders were left, whether any flank still held. A burst of static shattered that moment's quiet. "Commander, we've lost the east perimeter." Voices overlapped, each more desperate than the last. "They're inside the second trench. We can't hold. We're overrun. Fall back. We need air support." Then came a thunderous roar that silenced every other noise. Through a haze of ash, Rourke saw a colossal shape push through the ravaged city blocks. It was a multi-limbed monstrosity towering over the ruins, a living battering ram that shrugged off direct hits from rocket launchers. The behemoth had arrived. "All units, fall back to the interior block," Rourke ordered, voice cracking through the radio. "We can't fight that thing out here. Draw it in." Across the devastated streets, squads scrambled for the relative cover of half-demolished buildings. The behemoth plowed forward, each footfall shaking the earth and pulverizing barricades. Stray artillery shells landed against its arm-thick plating, causing only superficial damage. Monroe's sniper rounds pinged harmlessly off its hide. Keller, battered and burned, coordinated demolition charges in narrow alleys to slow the beast, but each explosion did little more than stagger it. All around, the smaller creatures poured in anew, overwhelming soldiers who lagged behind. Screams and unearthly shrieks echoed through the rubble. "Commander, we've got nothing left out here," Keller said over the comm, voice laced with defeat. Rourke watched as the behemoth obliterated what remained of a concrete barrier, crushing soldiers beneath falling debris. "Then we make our stand inside the city," he spat. "We bring that monster down with us if we have to." They had one last plan: lure the behemoth into a half-standing skyscraper, rigged to collapse. If the gods were kind, they could bury it, even if it meant burying themselves. The heart of New Denver was a graveyard of twisted steel and crumbling facades. Amid the destruction stood a single skyscraper that still defied gravity, though its walls were cracked and its floors compromised. It was there that Rourke's ragtag band would spring their final trap. Keller moved like a man possessed. placing charges along key support columns. Soldiers guarded shattered entrances, exchanging gunfire with the wave of smaller aliens that sought to flood inside. Upstairs, Monroe and her snipers positioned themselves at jagged window frames, taking pot shots at anything large or fast enough to threaten the setup. Vale, eyes bloodshot and hollow, searched for any wounded left behind in the chaos. Even if he couldn't save them, he refused to abandon them. A low, bone-rattling vibration announced the behemoth's approach. It tore through a wall of the skyscraper's ground floor, sending chunks of concrete flying. A soldier vanished under the collapsing rubble. Another was impaled by a spined limb. "Everyone upstairs, now!" Rourke roared. "Keller, you got the charges set." "Just about," Keller shouted, rushing to link the wires. "Get clear!" The behemoth forced its bulk deeper into the building, each step threatening to bring the whole structure down prematurely. Rourke stood by the central pillars, gripping a detonator slick with sweat. Any moment now, the entire place could give way. Monroe and Keller dashed to his side, dragging a wounded comrade who clutched a bloody stump where his arm had been. Vale stumbled in last, the reek of ash and smoke clinging to him like a shroud. "Commander, do it!" Keller yelled, voice echoing in the trembling corridor. Rourke locked eyes with the towering monstrosity. Its alien gaze bore into him, brimming with a dark intelligence. He pressed the detonator. A chain of explosions ripped through the building's support structure. Girders snapped, floors caved, and the entire skyscraper crumpled inward in a storm of flame and metal. The roar of collapsing concrete drowned out every other sound. Rourke threw himself behind a crumbling partition as steel beams crashed like falling guillotines. Dust and fire billowed up to the night sky, swallowing the behemoth in an avalanche of ruin. Silence settled over the wreckage. In the glow of scattered flames, one could make out the skeletal remains of the skyscraper, now a jagged heap of rubble. Above, the rift still loomed, but its pulsing had dulled. For the moment, no fresh abominations spilled from its depths. Coughing, ears ringing, Rourke pushed a slab of broken concrete aside. Everything hurt. He felt dampness on his face. Blood, sweat, or both. A flicker of movement drew his eye. Keller, face streaked with ash and blood, was waving weakly from behind twisted rebar. They had survived, at least a handful. Monroe leaned against a mangled beam, sniper rifle still slung over her shoulder. Vale knelt nearby, checking vitals for a wounded soldier. A few other survivors staggered upright, blinking as if emerging from a nightmare. A garbled signal crackled from Rourke's battered radio. Somehow, it was playing his own recorded voice, his final message, on a loop. "Keep fighting." He took a breath that rattled his ribs, then lifted the radio to his lips. In the vacuum of sound, his voice emerged rough but unyielding. "New Denver stands," he said, words echoing in the still air. "We're alive. If you're hearing this, keep fighting. Don't give up." All around them lay the aftermath of a cataclysm. Fires smoldered in broken streets. The colossal shape of the behemoth was nowhere to be seen, buried, burned, or perhaps only stunned beneath the ruins. The smaller creatures had scattered or gone dormant, leaving the city in an uneasy calm. In that fragile silence, the survivors took shaky steps over broken glass and twisted steel. They were bruised, bloodied, and severely outnumbered, yet they had done the impossible. They stopped the unstoppable, at least for one more day. The rift still glared overhead like an open wound, but for the first time since the invasion began, something like hope stirred among them. They were not finished. Not yet. Long after the dust settled, Rourke's voice crackled on the radio, urging any who still drew breath. "Keep fighting!